Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome to Pacific Power's 2024 Oregon Wildfire Mitigation Plan webinar. We're so happy to have you with us today. Just a note, we will do a question and answer after the presentation. You can drop your questions into the chat. The recording from this webinar will be posted on Pacific Power's YouTube page within the next few days if you want to take a look at that. Today, our webinar is going to be presented by Alan Barrett, who is our Vice President of Transmission and Distribution Operations. He is also over our wildfire mitigation program. And with that, Alan, I'll let you take it away.
Sounds good. Thanks, Hallie. Good afternoon, everybody. So as Hallie mentioned, I'm going to be walking through the wildfire mitigation plan for Pacific Power in Oregon. And so hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about what that means for Pacific Power and what's inside our wildfire mitigation plan. And hopefully you'll also learn a little bit about what you can do as well to be prepared for this year's wildfire season. So let's go ahead and get into it. Let's go to the next slide and let's just look at the different topics I'm going to go through. So here's the agenda. And we're going to start off by reviewing the company's plan development and the journey we've been on. And then we'll dive into some of the specific aspects of the wildfire mitigation plan. And we'll go over how we review and have identified certain areas of our service territory as heightened fire risk and what that means. We'll look at our situational awareness, how we're monitoring the risk conditions in our weather station network. We'll then touch on our strategic programs and the system hardening we have as a response to that risk identification. And then we'll touch on our public safety power shutoff program and the protocols around that and what that looks like and how we prepare for it. And then we'll touch on community outreach and education. And so given the short amount of time we have today, I'll be speaking at a pretty high level. But I would encourage you, if you want more detail, to go to Pacific Power's webpage, and there you can find the Oregon Wildfire Mitigation Plan published, and you can download it and open it up and read through all the detail that's inside that plan. So, but we'll touch on some of the highlights throughout this presentation. So going to the next slide, let's just take a look at the overview of the journey we've been on when it comes to wildfire mitigation at Pacific Power. And it goes back to 2018, coming out of California, where the official rulemaking is where we first got started with the development and starting the development of our official wildfire mitigation plan. And so while that started in California, it quickly then expanded across the other states we serve. So it expanded into Oregon in 2019, establishing what that program would look like in Oregon. And then each year, it's continued to evolve, mature, and you see the years that our official plan filings in Oregon were published and made available, and each year where we refine those, republish those, update them as we go forward, and we'll continue to do that into the future. And you just see that journey on the top half of the slide there, every year's activities. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about the lower half of the screen here, which is the elements that make up the wildfire mitigation plan. And you can really boil that plan down to three main areas. So first, on the left, we'll talk about situational awareness. And this is the foundation of the mitigation plan. This is where we are identifying the fire risk across our service territory. Now, to do that, we break that down into two components, and I like to describe them as a long-term view and a short-term view. So for the long-term view of risk, we go back 30 years and you look at the historical weather, you look at wildfires in the area, you look at geography, and you look at population density, structures, fuel type, is it a forest, is it grassland? You look at all that history, all that data, and you put it through a risk model that then uses that to forecast forward where the fire high risk areas are in our service territory, in the area we serve in Oregon. And that provides, with that longer term view, saying if I take that 30-year history, where are the areas that are the highest potential for a catastrophic wildfire. It's important to understand it that way. We've identified areas that aren't the most probable location of a wildfire, but it's saying if a fire started there for any reason, utility related or lightning caused or anything else, if a fire started in that location, it has the characteristics, the potential to be a catastrophic wildfire, meaning it has the potential for that wildfire to spread rapidly. It has the potential to be hard to put out because it's a difficult area to get to. It has the potential for impacting people and structures. And so it's just the ingredients for a catastrophic fire. So not the probability of a fire, but if a fire occurred, it has the ingredients to be a catastrophic wildfire. So we've identified the areas that have that potential using that long-term view, that long-term risk modeling. And I've got some more slides where we'll touch on that and show where those areas are. But in addition to that risk modeling and complementing it is a short-term risk model. Now, this is where we take our meteorology department, we'll talk more about that later, but an internal meteorology team that is then looking at this year's conditions, this week's conditions, today's conditions, creating a forecast that says, I've looked across the service territory, I create a risk forecast every day of the year, and we identify, are there elevated fire risk conditions anywhere in our service territory? Whether or not it's in those high risk areas that were identified in the long term, but just with the short term model, is there any area that say is drier than normal, is windier than normal today that puts it in an elevated fire risk condition? In between those two models, that allows us to identify the risk both on a long-term basis and what's going on today that might buck that long-term trend, but allows us to not be surprised by fire risk conditions. Putting those together allows us to identify the risk across our service territory in Oregon any day of the year. We run that model in the wintertime just as much as we do in the middle of summer, which we traditionally think of as our fire season. But we run it all the time because we don't want to be surprised. That's the situational awareness. And we'll talk a little bit more about the weather station and meteorology on a slide coming up. But using that information, having identified the risk, that then takes us to the middle category of operational practices. Because once we've identified the risk, we now deploy operating practices that address that fire risk. So as the fire risk escalates, so does our response, so does our posture. And so inside operational practices is how we operate the network. How do we conduct business? And so that includes all kinds of activities. That includes our inspections programs, vegetation programs, but it also includes how we do work on a daily basis. Think of our construction crews, and they are looking at the risk, fire risk for a given day, and we're deciding whether or not different types of equipment should be taken out to the job. Should a water tank be taken out? Should that work be done at all? If it should be done, should the work be done energized or de-energized? These are all the considerations that under operating practices, just given the fire risk for a day, we have control over. We have control over whether or not how we restore an outage. So say if elevated fire conditions and there's just a normal outage, for some reason there was a disturbance out on the line and something caused an outage, that instead of reclosing and re-energizing, we send somebody out to patrol the line because there's fire risk conditions and we want to make sure we have eyes on the entire line before we restore the outage. Maybe we wouldn't patrol the outage at night and we would have to wait till the next morning when it's daylight. We can better assess the situation before restoring power. These are decisions that are, as we evaluate the risk in a given area, how we're going to respond to outages. Operational practices also includes if there's an active wildfire nearby our electrical system. So imagine a fire, lightning-caused wildfire, is a number of miles away from the power lines. But as it draws closer, we monitor that wildfire. And if it gets too close to the electrical system, then we do an emergency de-energization of our lines to ensure that our lines aren't going to make the situation worse of an active wildfire. We don't want the active wildfire getting into the lines. We don't want an energized line making it harder for the first responders to respond to that wildfire and try to put it out. So we have an emergency de-energization protocol as well that can address an active wildfire. The last one I'll touch on in operational practices, and we'll talk about a little bit later, is public safety power shutoff, which is if the conditions are so extreme. And so think of that as top 5% dryness, top 5% windy, kind of these extreme, most extreme environmental conditions, extreme fire risk conditions, where it would be better to de-energize the electrical system, let those conditions pass, let the wind die down, and then re-energize the lines afterwards. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. We're balancing that decision about de-energizing and the risk of not having power in a community and versus the risk of energized lines in extreme fire risk conditions. But we have that operational protocol as well. Leading up to public safety power shutoff, I should also touch on we can put the system in a more sensitive mode. So it's still energized, but there's devices on the line, relays, reclosers. These devices are monitoring the lines. And if they detect a disturbance of any kind, like fault current because a branch slapped the wire of an overhead line on its way to the ground and created this fault, these systems can detect that, open up the line in a fraction of a second, and then stay de-energized until we get someone out there to assess the situation, and then we can re-energize. So we can operate in a very sensitive mode depending on the risk condition for that day as well. All right. So that's what's available to us in operational practices in response to the risk that's been identified. The third category in the wildfire mitigation plan on the far right would be system hardening. So now you think back to that long-term risk modeling I talked about, where we identified a section of our service territory that has that potential for catastrophic wildfire. The risk is so high that instead of just relying on operational practices, we add an additional layer of looking at rebuilding our system and changing it so that it has even more resilience against those fire risk environmental conditions. And so what does that mean? Well, that means looking at the overhead lines that might be in those areas. And instead of having that bare wire that's running from pole to pole, we can replace that wire with a covered conductor. So now you imagine a tree branch that might be blown by the wind, and instead of hitting a bare metal conductor going pole to pole, it hits an insulated wire. And so it doesn't touch the bare metal. The branch just hits like a plastic covering over the bare wire. No fault current, no spark, no potential for ignition, and that branch just continues to fall to the ground. And so rebuilding our lines, and that could include when we look to rebuild, well, does undergrounding make sense? That could be part of system hardening. So just rebuilding the system to dramatically reduce the fire risk that it can be in that area. It also includes installation of new devices. I talked about the relays and reclosers, these devices that are monitoring the line and looking to open up very quickly and those types of settings. We can install more of those devices that are out there on the line as well. That's under system hardening too. So in those three categories, situational awareness, operational practices, system hardening makes up the bulk of the wildfire mitigation plan. But running throughout that, and it's at the lower portion of the screen, there's engagement, and that's engagement with our customers, with our public safety partners, with other utilities in the industry, with the PUC, the commission, and just making sure that we're on the same page with setting expectations, coordination, because this isn't us as a utility alone. We fully realize this is about providing power to communities, and we want to make sure that there's good communication, education, feedback, and just in order to pull off a successful wildfire mitigation plan. So that engagement runs throughout the plan as well. All right, if we go to the next slide, it gives you a view of where exactly is Pacific Power in Oregon. So you see a map there of our service territory shown in blue. And so just to give you some statistics on the service territory we serve, we provide electricity to approximately 642,000 customers, and that's through 200 substations spread out across that territory. 19,800 miles of distribution lines and about 3,000 miles of transmission lines that cross that 21,000 square miles of service territory across Oregon. All right? So it's across that entire service territory that you see there is where those system-wide initiatives are being applied, such as the weather station deployment, that situational awareness, that forecast of where is the risk every day of the year. That's being done across the entire service territory. Now, inside the areas of that we've identified as the higher risk areas, the higher fire risk areas, that's where modified work practices like the inspections take place as well. And we'll look at that on the next slide. But to give you a sense of just how much construction activity was accomplished in 2023 in Oregon, Pacific Power replaced over 100 miles of bare conductor that I was talking about earlier with that insulated covered conductor. We also installed over 75 reclosers and relays and circuit breakers, as well as installing over 7,900 expulsion fuses. And that's replacing the current fuses that are out on that overhead line with a type of fuse that, when it operates, reduces the potential for any type of hot metal spark to fall to the ground. So it doesn't provide that opportunity for a wildfire ignition to occur when those devices operate. So that's some of the activity that's taken place across the service territory in 2023. Let's go to the next slide and look at where these areas in Oregon of heightened fire risk or fire high consequence areas. You'll hear us refer to it as an FHCA, but that's the areas that have those characteristics for catastrophic wildfire, that if a wildfire happened there, it could move quickly, it could impact people, it would be hard to put out. It has the ingredients to be catastrophic. And so through Pacific Power implementing modeling tools to support that location-specific risk identification that informs the rest of the wildfire mitigation program, we've been able to identify these areas. And these areas, as you can see, mostly in Southern Oregon, but you see it all the way up in Hood River. But you get a sense of where it's spread out across our service territory. The table there on the slide showing you specifically like what percentage of our service territory is in these high risk areas, and about 21% of our Oregon service territory in these areas of heightened fire risk, right? It's in these areas that Pacific Power deploys its enhanced vegetation management and increased frequency of asset inspections. And that's also where that system hardening I talked about with the overhead conductor and possibly underground changes. That's where that system hardening is prioritized and targeted, right? That's where we'd want to start that focused system hardening. All right, as we transition to the next slide, we're going to hit on the situational awareness, right? And so remembering back to I was talking about the risk modeling, we had the long-term and we had a short-term risk modeling. And so this kind of gets at the short-term risk modeling, which how in real time we have this dynamic risk assessment through situational awareness and weather forecasting that can be done anywhere and almost in real time across our service territory. How do we do that? Well, our approach has been to build out our own weather station network. And so you see on the screen there the numbers where we've installed 153 weather stations across Oregon that collect and provide data to our internal meteorology team that can grab that data every 10 minutes and help support that risk modeling and decision making that's going on. We're going to continue to build out that weather station network. By the end of this year, it'll be up to about 190 weather stations is where we'll be at the end of the year. And really, as we continue to refine that risk modeling and we'll determine through feedback of the model where if there's any gaps and we need additional weather stations, we'll continue to build out that weather station. Because if you think of all the micro kind of weather climates that can exist in valleys, on peaks throughout the service territory, you got to keep installing these weather stations to get the weather at each of those specific locations and bring it back into the model. So we'll continue to build out that weather station network as we go. As I mentioned, to help us evaluate all that data, we do have an internal 6-person meteorologist team. And so this was developed over the last three years where we brought that skill set in-house and they're able to analyze all that data and be able to create that risk modeling that helps us just inform those operational practices I talked about earlier, as far as, well, how should we be operating the system today? How should we be responding to outages? Is there a public safety power shutoff condition in the forecast so that we can see that sooner, because we want to notify customers of that potential. We want to notify our public safety partners if that potential is on the horizon. So we have that skill set internal to the company. Should also note that we have plans to install 5 additional wildfire detection cameras that have that artificial intelligence built into them that can help detect smoke plumes, and it basically allows not only us to be alerted if a wildfire was to occur, but also as a direct alert to our first responders, so that they can respond to that fire potential as quickly as possible and resolve it, right? So we have multiple layers of defense when it comes to wildfire mitigation, even beyond if an ignition was to occur, can we respond to it more quickly? And that's what those cameras allow as well. And that's partnering and collaboration with first responders in the various areas. So there's a lot of information coming back from this weather station network that we can analyze, that we're looking at the risk modeling, and we make that data available to the public as well. And so you can go to pacificpowerweather.com. You can see all those weather stations. You can click on each one of them. You can see the latest information coming back. And so while we use that data, we also make the data available to the public. All right, let's go to the next slide. And let's talk about how the operational practices escalate as the conditions escalate, right? And that's what I want you to take away from this slide. So if you look at the bottom part of the slide, it shows how fire risk conditions can escalate from, say, a dark green, middle of winter, really wet, very low fire risk, right? And then, yeah, things start drying out, and then you can get into an elevated fire risk, significant, and extreme fire risk. And that's getting at how windy is it? How dry is it? What's the moisture content? What's the fuel conditions out there? And you can build up to the far right, which is this extreme fire risk. But before we get to that extreme, as we can just monitor the conditions and see things drying out, we can take appropriate actions at the right time. And so in those high risk areas where we know it has the potential for a catastrophic wildfire, we can go into the more sensitive mode sooner. So in those areas, we want to create a nice buffer between where we know the majority of the catastrophic wildfires occur, even though we know those happen in the extreme fire conditions, significant fire risk conditions, that's where the bad wildfires occur. Even though the data shows us that, we don't want to walk up close to that cliff's edge that the data has identified. We want to create a nice safety buffer that as we approach those environmental conditions, that we're turning on the more sensitive settings, the enhanced safety settings, before we get there. And we do that sooner in the high risk areas. Then for the rest of the service territory, a little bit later, we get into the elevated fire risk, but still with a nice buffer before you get to that significant fire risk. And so it's about finding the balance of when do you operate the system in a more sensitive setting, which means that if a disturbance is detected out there, the branch that hits the line, some type of outage, that it opens up very quickly and stays open. And so from a customer's perspective, what that would look like is more outages that seem a little bit longer, because we got to send somebody out, do a full patrol, make sure the conditions and that it's all okay before re-energizing. And so we realize there's an impact to that. That risk reduction comes at an impact of what the customer would see. And so deciding the right mix of when do we deploy that measure versus the risk it's reducing, the fire risk that it's addressing, and making sure those are in balance. And so as the fire risk escalates, we deploy more and more of those risk measures as we go. If you get to that extreme fire risk, that's when we're talking about the public safety power shutoff. That's where it's just de-energize the system, let the conditions pass, and then re-energize. But if you look at just those enhanced safety settings where we're just running in a more sensitive mode, we did that last year in Oregon, and about 52% of our overhead distribution circuits in Oregon were in that mode some portion of the year. Some of them, it maybe was only for a week, maybe others were running in that mode for 2 months. And so we have experience doing it, looking to do it again in 2024. But that's all in a way to balance that fire risk that's out there and the outages and the little bit longer duration of outages that results in, but it just helps us balance that risk out. And so we have a view of that as we go forward. All right. Let's go back to looking at, on the next slide, the underlying programs that we're running, though, to address fire risk. Those, the enhanced safety settings and the public safety power shutoff, are in a response to as the fire risk conditions and for that day, for that week are escalating. That's our response that's escalating. But underlying that are programs, right, of us just making sure that we have eyes on our equipment and that we're inspecting it and that we're resolving any issues and that the underlying system is in good condition. And so how do we do that? Well, that's through asset inspections. That's through going out and getting eyes on the poles, the wire, the equipment that's on the poles, and making sure that if anything is identified that needs to be corrected, that it's noted and that we fix it as soon as possible, right? That those conditions are resolved. And so it's about an underlying inspection program. And in the high risk areas, we do it even more frequently. We do it annually as opposed to every other year, or the detailed inspections every 5 years. And so in those high risk areas, we do it more often than everywhere else. But underlying it all is inspections of the assets and getting them and understanding their conditions. It's the same thing on the vegetation management side, where we're going out and inspecting the lines, but here we're inspecting to make sure there's good clearance between the trees and the power lines. And we do this through maintaining a regular trimming cycle in Oregon. We're every 3 years going through and trimming the trees back from the line, making sure there's good clearance. But it also involves identifying any hazard trees that are near the line. So think of this like any dead or dying trees, because as we're getting into more drought conditions and trees are dying, you want to remove the tree before that tree falls over into the power system, right? And so we identify the trees and remove them. That's part of the underlying vegetation management program, and doing that more frequently in the FHCA, annual inspections in those high risk areas. We also, as part of that program, clear the base of the power pole, where if there's any equipment on that power pole, we'll clear the vegetation away from the base of that pole 10 feet in all directions, just to make sure there's nothing at the base of that pole, that if the equipment was to malfunction for any reason, if a spark was to leave any of the equipment at the top of the pole, that if it fell to the base of that pole, there's no vegetation to ignite. There's no potential for an ignition at the base of the pole. And so pole clearing is also part of the program. So on the screen there, you can see the volumes that we're talking about, as far as thousands of miles of line being inspected, and the 24,000 poles being cleared. So a lot of activity, and we'll be continuing that same effort this year, right? So don't be surprised if you see our inspectors, if you see the line workers, if you see the vegetation crews working in your communities and neighborhoods. That's them as part of the wildfire mitigation program, just out there doing the inspections. All right, the next slide is going to touch on the system hardening aspect, if you remember that last bucket of the wildfire mitigation program. And so in addition to that underlying inspection program, vegetation management, in addition to how we can operate the system in different levels of risk, this is where we're rebuilding the system to add that additional layer of wildfire mitigation, where we're actually rebuilding the system to make it more resilient. And so in Oregon, this represents a longer term investment of over $160 million to rebuild these lines, add those additional relays and reclosers, and change out the fuses. So it's a large investment, and it's over a number of years, right? And that's in contrast to the operational practices, which can be deployed quicker, is available across our entire service territory. It's available every day of the year. And system hardening is this longer term effort, large investment, and it takes every project is like a multi-year project. If you think of the designing, engineering, permitting, construction, all that's involved in rebuilding the lines, right? So in terms of how many miles we will be rebuilding. It represents in Oregon over 600 miles here in the next several years to be rebuilt. And when we look at an overhead line to be rebuilt, we're looking at either, maybe we can move it, maybe we can even remove it if the way the system's designed, or we rebuild it to the covered conductor that I talked about earlier, or maybe it can be underground, or maybe it's some combination. And what we do is we just evaluate what's the best solution for this area to mitigate the risk. And while covered conductor is the starting point, because it's the most economical as far as reducing that fire risk by providing that plastic cover to the bare metal. Sometimes, though, undergrounding, just based on the access and that at that given location and what's going on, can be an appropriate solution as well. It's just undergrounding can cost quite a bit more than the covered conductor, some 4 times, 5 times more expensive. So it's finding the right balance of the investment we're making versus the risk reduction that's being achieved. And so that's what's being weighed as we look at each one of these overhead miles and evaluate the project. What does that rebuild project look like? So as far as what progress has been made in 2022 and into last year, much of the construction activity was focused in the areas like Enterprise, Hood River, Roseburg, Grants Pass, Medford, over in Klamath Falls, and where about a little over 82 miles of rebuild has been achieved so far. And specifically this year, we're looking to do an additional 125 miles by the end of the year, all working towards that 600 miles and plus in the next 3 or 4 years. So that's what the system hardenings looked like in Oregon. All right. So we go, now we're going to shift and we're going to talk about public safety power shutoff. Right? And so, as I mentioned earlier, this is where we get into those really extreme fire risk conditions where we're evaluating the risk of keeping the power energized during that versus the community not having power, right? And so public safety power shutoff is where we decide to de-energize to reduce that risk, let those conditions pass, and then re-energizing. But in order to make sure that we're prepared for that and that the right decision making is going on, we facilitate collaborative sessions with our public safety partners year-round to have workshops and outreach events, and that's to make sure that we're prepared for what a public safety power shutoff or PSPS would look like, right? And so there's a lot of education, a lot of outreach, a lot of coordination that goes into it. And so you see on the left-hand portion of the slide there, as far as the activities for 2024, when you look at the regional tabletop, the wildfire forums that are going on across our service territory in Oregon, or maybe where we're showing up to another public safety partners at community events, and participating in their events, or we're hosting them, or we're showing up to town halls, or we're holding functional exercises, holding workshops. It's really about facilitating that conversation, because public safety power shutoff is a tool of last resort. It is to address that most extreme wildfire risk condition, but we understand there's an impact that a public safety power shutoff event has on a community. Not having power can make it harder to respond to an active event if there's a wildfire event going on. And so therefore, at the core of our decision making for a public safety power shutoff, it's about our coordination with others. It's about reaching out to a community and understanding what the impacts would be to them to have power or not have power, and making sure that's all incorporated into us deciding whether or not we're going to enter into a public safety power shutoff. But if a public safety power shutoff event is conducted, we then want to lessen the impact to the community that will be without power for that duration. And so one of the tools we have is the Community Resource Center. That's mentioned on the right-hand side of the screen there. And that's where we coordinate with our public safety partners in a community so that we can establish these community resource centers. So think of them as like a shelter. That can be either a temporary shelter in a parking lot, like a tent, or it can be in a community that has a physical location already identified, and we go inside that building and we set up this community resource center that provides services You see it there on the screen, some air conditioning, get out of the heat, a place to get information, a place to charge up their devices. It's just recognizing that they don't have power at their house, giving them somewhere to go. And so that's what the community resource centers are. And we have successfully implemented those in the past. In 2022, when we had our public safety power shutoff event in Oregon, that was when our last one was, we activated 3 community resource centers. And so we do have experience with establishing those and providing that to our customers to show up to in an event. Now, also in a public safety power shutoff event or leading up to an event, there is a lot of information that needs to be shared with our public safety partners. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you can envision when we identify an area, we have to be sharing not only the GIS boundaries of like the location of, well, what area are we talking about to potentially be de-energized? But then it's about quickly getting at what critical infrastructure would be impacted by that so that we could share that information with public safety partners so that they can go look at what the impacts mean to them, what do they need to do on their side. And so think about like backup generation for a hospital or what can be done for the communication in a community of like a cell phone tower, and how can we keep that going in a public safety power shutoff if it's within the area? What kind of backup generation can be provided at those locations? So it's about being able to share the impacts back and forth very quickly and making that available to all during an event so that we can be well coordinated and it can be a successful event and reduce that potential for wildfire. All right. Let's go to the next slide. Because now we get into if that's what public safety power shutoff looks like to the company as far as what to expect from Pacific Power leading up to a public safety power shutoff and us notifying customers. But in order to be able to notify our customers, what we'd ask of customers is to make sure your contact information is up to date. So this slide is about steps you can take to be prepared for the upcoming fire season. And the easiest way is to either give us a call, the phone number you see there on the screen, visit our website and log on to your account and update your contact information. And that way we know how to get a hold of you if we need to notify you of a public safety power shutoff, right? Step 2 there shown on the slide is about, hey, take a look at your property and create that defensible space. If a wildfire was to be near your home, and look at how to create that defensible space from vegetation around your house that might catch fire and what kind of barriers can you create between where that wildfire could be and leading up to your home. And so creating a defensible space and looking at your property with that in mind. And the third one, which is not only a good idea for wildfire preparedness, but just emergency planning in general, whether it would be a winter storm, an ice storm, anything that could cause an outage, any type of an event, is to have an emergency plan, have emergency supplies on hand at your house and your home. Make sure your family's prepared to just what to expect and where to go, and do you have supplies in your house for any type of an event. So that's always a good reminder as well. So those are some steps that you can do to be prepared for this upcoming fire season or any event. All right, the next slide, and I touched on it just briefly on the other 2 slides, but let me make sure I'm emphasizing it correctly, is that if you're a vulnerable customer, a customer that relies on, say, medical equipment in your house, and if you can contact us and if you feel comfortable doing so, self-identify as a medical customer, that has medical equipment that there's concerns. And if you register with us with that way, when we're making our notifications, like a public safety power shutoff, you won't just get the normal notification of, say, an automated phone call or a text message or an email, but you'll get a personal phone call from a Pacific Power agent to make sure that your needs are being addressed and that you're all right, and that if anything can be done, we can help you in arranging that for you while the public safety power shutoff event is going on. And so we want to make sure we get a hold of you. So if you're one of those customers, we want to make sure your information is up to date. We want to make sure you're registered under the medical program so that those notifications are done correctly for you and meet your needs, right? And so the information's there on the screen. Encourage you to go to our website, pacificpower.net, and get that information about how to register under that program. Of note in Oregon as well is the backup power rebate program. And so in 2023, Pacific Power began offering this program, which is a rebate program to customers, and it's still active today, where all residential Oregon customers who are enrolled in that medical program I talked about earlier are eligible to claim a rebate of up to $4,000 on the purchase of a qualifying power supply and a battery backup for the medical equipment that might be required at your house. And so, again, to learn more about that, go to pacificpower.net and look at the power rebate program and see if you qualify. All right, and so with that, I think we'll hit the last slide here, which is just about our community outreach and education. So in addition to the investment I've talked about, the operational protocols, the customer programs of public safety power shutoff and the battery backup program. Well, when it comes to outreach, Pacific Power takes a multi-pronged approach throughout the year to ensure wildfire preparedness and education is occurring for our customers and across the communities we serve. And so we facilitate the sessions I talked about earlier. If you think back to those forums and the tabletop exercises with our public safety partners in the communities, and that's where we work with our partners to prepare for that potential public safety power shutoff events or other emergencies. But we also work to get the word out, right? To get the information out in the communities we serve via other tools like social media and radio campaigns and brochures and flyers. We also host webinars like the one we're doing today, which is just to make sure that the outreach is being done, that the education is in place, and that there's an understanding of what wildfire mitigation looks like, what to expect from Pacific Power, and tell you about the resources that are available, right? And then throughout the year, we do maintain additional information on our website. So always pointing back to our website at pacificpower.net, where you can get additional information, updated information throughout the year, or if we're leading up to an event, that information will be posted on our webpage as well. So with that, I think that takes us to the end. And so I know I talked at a very high level about the elements that make up the wildfire mitigation plan. It represents a large investment. What I would want to make sure I'm emphasizing correctly is that situational awareness is occurring every day of the year across our service territory so that we can identify that fire risk and that we can deploy the appropriate levels of operational practices, the appropriate levels of risk reduction wherever it's required as we work towards that longer-term system hardening in those high fire risk areas. So with that, Hallie, I turn it back over to you to see what kind of questions we might have.